Thank you. Hi, everyone. Actually, Sarah Rose, can you help me? There's just like this one picture. Okay, just pass around. Okay, great. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. I love sharing about the Radical Repair Workshop. It's been so stymied by the pandemic and by some of my own personal health challenges that have gone on in the past year and a half, 2 years, that I'm just like rearing to get it back going. So I'm just gonna jump in. It's so close to that conversation y'all were just having. So I want you to keep that kind of material proximity culture in your mind, because that's basically what I'm obsessed with, is like items and materials with history. And let me just set the timer because I have a lot of slides and I'm going to try to not go really crazy on the time. So let me just set one more thing. Coming around are just some textile examples of like repairs that people have done in some of my workshops. I was going to have y'all do something by hand, but it just felt like a little hard to coordinate. So touch, feel, hold, whatever. It's nice to just have your hands on something. So, the Radical Repair Workshop, what is it? It is a traveling public art project that I launched in about January 2020, housed in this cute camper, as Sarah Rose said, which is named Sunny. And it stems from my sculptural practice. So it looks at how can we use materials, use the sort of concept of repair to sculptural ends, and what happens when we don't actually know how to fix something back to functionality. What happens when we fix it back to something that's in a different space, sentimentality, whatever. So inside the workshop, I rehabbed this camper, which was like a total disaster. Beck, my partner, was really monumental and essential in that process. But I basically stripped this camper because it was rotting, set up a little workshop space, a library in the sink. On one side, I built a gallery wall. And then the kind of main eating area is for conversations and teaching and sitting and thinking about repair. It also has a lot of junk in it, just stuff that people bring me or that I've accumulated that needs repair or is looking at some aspect of repair. So the beauty of it, actually, Jade photographed me, I think, here when the when the repair workshop was at the Durham station. But one thing that I was focused on when thinking about this public art project, I'll show you a little later. I'm actually like a studio artist, so this is my first big public project, but I really wanted it to be something that could go anywhere, that would be free for participants, with certain exceptions, but that I could just roll up and, open the doors and invite people in and start talking about repair. So I don't know what's going on here. Can y'all hear me? So it's been to the Durham station, it's been to Duke University, it's been as far as Western Carolina University, where I was working last semester. And the idea is that, I can open the doors, people can bring things to work on repairing. I also have repair workshop days where we have a more specific focus, like textiles or ceramics or chairs or really you name it. And people bring things or I provide things that we look at and we talk about their materiality, we talk about their sentimentality, and we fix them. And I say that with quotes because we're not necessarily interested in repairing them perfectly. We're interested in getting the stories out of them. So I love this picture. You can't see it that well, but it's Marshall, who's one of the curators at the Nasher, and he had like never sewn, and he came and he had just like learned to sew sew up the hole in his pants. And I love that it's reaching, like these fancy PhDs who've never sewn, and then also like kids and random people, trying to catch the bus. Like it is literally, my goal is to get everyone in the door. So here's just some shots of different projects that were happening. These both happen to be at Duke. There's darning happening, which a lot of the samples floating around is darning, but that's a technique of weaving over a hole. Typically, you find it on socks and sweaters, but again, we like to kind of go outside of that. So we've done darning on holes in wood and, just looking at, well, there's a hole, why can't I cover it with like a nice little tapestry weaving kind of thing. And then some unusual approaches to ceramics repair. So what I really love is when people come and they sort of take the project on themselves. So the sentimental objects that show up really might not be able to be repaired. This woman with the shovel smashing this glass object, that was her idea. She was amazing. She had this thing that belonged to a family member of hers who was no longer living, but it was just a little broken. And she was like, it's just like this corner's chipped off. And I feel like if I just glue it together, it's going to look cheesy. And so she eventually came to the conclusion, like, I need to break this down further in order to reunite its meaning. And what she ended up doing was smashing it with a shovel and then smashing another piece of glass that was her mother's and then like merging these two objects. I don't know why I don't have a final photo of it, but you can just maybe imagine it in your mind's eye. But she really sort of got the essence of like, oh, it's never going to be the same as it was. And for her, it was loaded because it was this family member who is no longer with us. And so I think it was like really cathartic. So that's really one of the goals of the project, is like just to provide the space for people to be wild with their own materials, because we tend to get a little pent up with things that hold a lot of history or meaning or stories of our ancestors or whatnot. So then it's also just a place for fun. These two ladies were just like best buds, and they came and they didn't have a project, and they took on this really wild rocking chair and wove it a whole new bottom and just left like laughing. It was like the cutest thing ever. So some of their approaches are more abstract or decorative or not functional, wall hanging made out of shattered pottery. Sometimes we do. I'm not anti practical repair. I really love practical repair. But sometimes we do it in a way that, maybe we highlight the repair rather than trying to hide it. So this was a quilt that just using old bindings that I had, I rebound, and now it's like a really cute new quilt. Cute new old quilt. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back in time, if you'll come on this journey with me, just through my own art practice a little bit, because again, as my first public art project, it feels important for me to kind of show y'all where it came from. Because I've done art my whole life, and I've always loved materials and loved the process of just like doing hands-on things. And so I've always been really dedicated to material culture, just material objects, breaking things down. I grew up like working at the scrap exchange, and I've been in this community that really supports that. I don't know if anybody remembers the old days of Durham School of the Arts, but like the sculpture teacher there was like kind of a hoarder. Love you, Mr. Downing. But like he just like really like spun the reality of like any material can be used for art making. He put that in me really early. So that was really, really nice. But this image is actually the surface of a lake in Guatemala, Lake Atitlan. I was down there with Bryant Holstenbeck doing an art workshop years and years and years ago. And we were there while there was a hurricane, and this once picturesque lake, suddenly after all this wind blew in, was like this really crazy collection of natural materials mixed with styrofoam and trash and like just crazy, crazy stuff. And I just remember taking a picture because I was like, this feels very kind of at odds with the touristic view of this lake, which is known for it's a crater lake. It's like known for its epic views. And I had this, it like all sort of clicked for me in grad school when kind of the same thing happened. I don't know if folks have spent time in Providence, but there's like a river right down through the middle of town. And again, it was like this very windy day, and like basically the exact same stuff showed up on the surface of the water. So there was like a ball and like a bunch of styrofoam cups. And I'd been reading this book called Hyper Objects by Timothy Morton. And the idea is that there are some materials and some ideas that are so big that we can't experience them as a whole, but we can see these like uprisings of them in various places. So like the concept of how much styrofoam is there on Earth is like impossible to conceptualize, but we see it through these moments where like you're walking down this like usually clean path, and then suddenly you're like, whoa, here's the same styrofoam. This could be the same cup that was like in this crater lake in Guatemala, right? So I had this kind of aha moment where I was like, oh, that's what I do. Like I actually take really, really familiar objects and force people to look at them in a way. So this is kind of a life-size sculpture. That's the base of a chair that I just took all the detritus in my studio. You can see like a deodorant can, and then there's like this little note from my brother, with his address on it, and like old stuff from my studio. And I just like externalized it and made this shell over a chair as sort of a self-portrait. Here's just another close-up. My favorite part of this is the soy sauce and the duck sauce packets, because it's like, who doesn't have so many of those in their drawer? Like, actually raise your hand if you don't have those around your house. Okay, maybe one person. But yeah, just like the sort of universality of these objects and like what happens when you know, suspend them in space and time through a piece of art. So the other side of my practice, I do things like kind of on all scales, big, small, whatever. But this was another of the really like grounding moments in my practice, which was looking into some of the creativity from my dad's forebearers, who were super rural North Georgia farmers, and just kind of really truly made do. And so there's all these excellent examples of handcraft in their family. Does anybody recognize what this basket may be made of? It's very familiar plant. It is a vine. Did I hear? Kudzu, yeah. So I had a great uncle who, in his retirement, he had like pretty severe PTSD from World War II. And so he just like had to stay super busy. And what he ended up doing was harvesting kudzu, which is free. Obviously, people were like, please take it. And just making like hundreds and hundreds of baskets. And so I love this like intersection of taking this like very invasive plant that's really, really prevalent in the South that also turns the South into this sculptural landscape, and weaving it into this functional thing to sort of like, distract oneself from the traumas of war. Like, I don't know, that there's like something really beautiful in seeing his handwork there. But the real moment for me was when I turned it over and his base was just like an old piece of 2x4. And the ingenuity of that, and like, let me go back. You would never know. It's like this, really well-crafted thing. And then to think that he was also being really creative and just thrifty and making do with what he found to make the object on at all. Felt like this, again, lightning strike moment. So I just started weaving baskets off of like anything. This is a hiking boot I had for like, I don't know, talk about the sentimental object, like 13 years, and hiked until literally I was duct taping it and gluing it together on the trail, and was like, okay, this has got to go. But I wasn't ready to let it go, and I'm trying to not be a hoarder, so I have to like produce something with it. So I just started making these things. And I find, again, my practice is really wide and varied, but whenever I am kind of stuck in my studio practice, I do end up going back to these this vessel series and just looking at like, okay, what can I make a vessel with in terms of with what materials I have around. So like clay, cardboard, glue, buttons, plaster, whatever. Some of them have real meaning. This middle one is a cake plate that was my grandmother's that I broke. And then I was like, oh God, I got to make a new cake. So I made this like weird trash cake. They all kind of, like, if you asked me what's in each one, I could probably tell you where the stuff came from. So they're both, again, like I'm looking at this universal, but also this down. Okay, enough about that. We're going to go back to radical repair. But that just gives you, that gives you a sense of like my material brain at work through some of these things. So I always, really even before I started the project, like just looked at how people did repair things in the wild and like the ingenuity that comes out of like needing to get to work and your bumper's falling off. So my favorite location for these things is always like in a parking lot. I walk around, I'm like, oh, Scotch tape, good one. Like truly, but they become these kind of patchworks, these like, like there's evidence of labor and sort of like necessity. Maybe you don't have the money to fix it up. Maybe you just don't have the time. Maybe you just don't care. But you had to like, get to work or whatever. So I'm always looking at just ways people are doing things. This is like a charcoal chimney thing. Our culture is really, really disposable. People don't take the time to fix things often. So I really appreciate when people do. So I try to take pictures of it, even when they're like total failures, like this smoking pole, or just very temporary, like this jean weaving. So I'm gonna cycle through a few of the things the thing that I've really, really appreciated about the Radical Repair Workshop, and something I could not have predicted, like truly had no idea what I was getting into when I started it, was just how many prongs, like how wide of abyss or opportunity, just like the one idea of repair would open, like how much would like just keep, I mean, it's still coming out. Like I still am just constantly like thinking of new ways to look at this project. So I'm going to cycle through just a few different versions of what the Radical Repair Workshop has done. And I should have said this at the front, but if you need to interrupt me and ask a question, like do it. So one project that I did was called Holy Teas. This was right before the pandemic smashed its fists down on tiny spaces that you walk into, such as the camper. But it was a project at Supergraphic, back when Bill Fick had that space in the warehouse or like in the storage units. We pulled the camper inside, and what I did was I asked people to send me their most holy tea, and that could be holy as in most personally meaningful, or holy as in literally full of holes. And I just kind of sent out like a quick, like, hey, I'm doing this thing, and can you send me this and answer a few questions? And I got like dozens and dozens of shirts. I was really interested in looking at them as an object, because they tend to sit at the bottom of your drawer and just like be there for sentimental reasons. But I also was really interested in kind of hearing like, why did you keep this? So everyone sent in like a little blurb about the shirt. This is a poet that I met actually at FOC. So he, of course, like wrote something really beautiful, but I'll read you just a little excerpt. I said, why have you hung onto this shirt? And he said, it's beautiful, it's soft, it has deer, it has a tractor trailer. It was one of my closest friends' most precious teas. Running free is a sailing term where your sheet is all the way out and you're cruising with the wind at your back, letting it carry you. So this applies to the tractor, but also the deer that is imperiled by the tractor. I often feel like a deer imperiled by tractor who still digs tractors. So I'm like, okay, David, good one. But everyone, he's a genius. But everyone has these like really, shockingly profound things to say about their favorite old T-shirts. So it was this space of just visiting those and reading about them and kind of laughing and crying with them. And I just sent them all back. Like I just did a photograph series that you can look at on my website. And now they're back in their drawers in various parts of the country. So Mending Monday, with the hashtag, came about because almost immediately the pandemic forced me and all of us online because the project started in January 2020. And I was like, oh man, we're all stuck. Like we're all living with our things. We're all like rearranging and making bread. And, what can I do to kind of add to the dialogue of that's productive? So I started having every Monday just fixing something that was in my house. And again, like a whole range of like productive fixes versus creative and weird fixes versus things that like I tried that while I was on Instagram Live, like didn't work. And many that Beck like stepped in and was like, this is actually how you do it. So it was this fun collaboration because I was like on live and people are like texting me. They're pretty rough, but they are all still on Instagram, like in the stories, if you want to go back and learn any of the techniques. But I did stuff like how to add a new quilt square over some quilt squares that have disintegrated. We fixed our car bumper, like we just like had the camera outside and so it was like a range of things, but it was a really fun way to connect with people and just kind of like do something and provide some skills. And I would always get these messages back kind of a few days later, like, oh, I fixed my sock. I was like, yeah. And it also was this series of conversations where like I was just, we were all on the screens and I was able to just connect with other people and talk about repair and talk about art and talk about being stuck in a house. And so it was this kind of interesting thing that also like really forced me to get some skills. I was like, ooh, I don't know how to fix this. So learning on the job, Pandemic conversations. So again, this was like I don't know, maybe summer 2020. I got some funding from the Center for Craft, which is in Asheville. And I proposed a project that, there's Bryant, one of our fellow speakers, but basically looking at, I'll say seniors, old people of a certain age who maybe were living in isolation deep in the pandemic, who I was really interested in like how's our relationship with our material surrounding changing since we're like really with it for so long. So Bryant I was able to do in person, and we selected an object in each participant's house and over the course of a series of conversations, repaired that object back towards something, maybe functionality, maybe play. And really that just kind of ended up as this series of conversations and texts. I did about 5 or 10. Honestly can't remember. That time's a blur. But Bryant and I fixed this lampshade, which really launched like this really interesting additional collaboration between us. We've always been friends, but we kind of were like, we got really into the making together. A friend of mine, Tom Milroy, we never even did anything with this, but he was like, oh, I replaced the spout on my bathtub, and he just kind of turned it into a puppet. And it's just like this weird thing. We've been like, he's always checking in on spout. And then I ended up repairing this beautiful bowl he had. And then this woman who I got connected with through a friend, Elnora Spencer, she is this folk artist and singer, amazing woman. She lives in Alabama. So we're like, on Zoom, on phone. We never repaired it because she was scared to send it to me and I couldn't travel. But, we had this long conversation about this plaster lion ashtray that was her dad's. And so it was just kind of mining this material culture, mining these conversations through that project. And then really the sort of culminating project I've been doing that I did most recently was this fellowship through the Library of Congress called the Archie Green Fellowship. And again, I said earlier, I'm not against real repair. And I realized I actually needed to sort of zoom back in time and learn more about the folks who are really doing repair. So my collaborator, Katie Clune, and I got this grant to basically interview repair professionals in the state. It was really, really tricky because it was COVID. But we did get our interviews done, and we talked to mostly local people just because travel was so hard, but we did a trip also down to the coast. But we talked to Damon Walker, who's one of the only Black luthiers in existence that he knows of. He repairs all kinds of string instruments. We talked to Jim Peterson, who is a premier wind instrument repairer based in Raleigh. We poked around in the workshop of this real character, Stephen Cash, who's a second or third generation shoe repairer. And we went over to Y&J Furniture and talked to Winfred Daniels, who's like 85, and he's been stripping furniture for 20 years. He had a really interesting life. So all these interviews are now in an archive on the Library of Congress website. And it was this fascinating project because, here I am looking at material culture, looking at how much things break because we make them out of plastic and really cheap materials. And we really got a sense of how, talking to these old timers, like how much worse manufacturing has become. Like truly, I thought that was sort of like, oh yeah, back in the blah, 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 everything was made better. But like, we really heard firsthand, like how much things have changed, how difficult it is to repair cheaply made objects. And like, for example, Stephen Cash, has anybody ever had a pair of shoes where you're like, maybe they're in your closet for a while, you haven't worn them for a few years, and you take them out and like, the soles have just fallen off, like spontaneously. You're like, I wasn't even wearing those. He was telling us that the glues that they use now just have a lifespan. They're like UV sensitive. So if they are near any light for any amount of time, they will just like at about 10 years, just fall apart. And he's like, a lot of the things he sees come in to be repaired now, he's like, people could buy a replacement so much cheaper. Most of the fixes he's doing are just based on sentimentality of the original object, like where people wore it or where they got it or any number of things. And I thought that was such an interesting connection because that's basically what I'm interested in is the sentimentality behind the objects, why we do hang on to like strange broken figurines. And the fact that even like in the professional realm, this is kind of how people are getting, at this point, we just don't have an idea of culture of repair. So those are the types of folks like coming in and getting stuff repaired is like, well, these were my grandma's shoes, so I'm gonna fix them. But that was true across the board. It was fascinating. We talked to plaster repairers, we talked to instrument repairers, eyeglass repair, and anything. We talked to 25 people. Every single one of them said, no, things they're just not as repairable. They're more cheaply made. So it was kind of inspiring that way just to, learn and hear those stories and see their really, really specified techniques and tragic because a lot of these things are kind of going away. One thing, is this connected to sound, the computer? No, okay. I'll turn this up as loud as possible. You can kind of read along. But I'm going to end with this really beautiful quote from Horace McKee, who works at Replacements Limited out in Greensboro. He's one of their China repairers, and he's just a real character. But I really liked what he said. Like, for me, it all comes back to the hands and like the touching and the conversation that you get through touching. So I'll just play this as loud as it's not going to go at all. We'll just read it. So he said, if you have a good set of hands, and not everyone does, use them. It can be very satisfying. Working with your hands opens your mind. There's a strong connection between your hands and your mind. And it's not something that's demeaning. It's not something that's beneath you. It can be rewarding in a multitude of ways. It can expand your understanding. And here's Horace using his hands to very delicately grind out a chip on a cup. And that's what we got going on. Thank you.